אנחנו עכשיו נעבור להרצאה המרכזית, ואני now want to introduce you, Peter. I'm not going, you didn't understand anything till now, but now I'm going to say something that you maybe know already about yourself. Okay, so Peter came to Israel only yesterday evening. It's his first time in Israel, and what could be better than start your visit with a keynote at the ISPRA conference. So welcome, Peter. Peter Bates is a social inclusion expert and has worked for the National Development Team for Inclusion between 1999 and 2013. Today he serves as an associate consultant to this organization. He previously worked in probation, the Employment Service, Social Services, the NHS, and audit. Since 2011, he also worked at the University of Nottingham promoting patient and public involvement in health services. Over the years, he was involved in many projects with a wide range of national bodies, including the Department of Health, and at NHS Confederation and the Scottish Government. In his work with over 150 local service providers, Peter's combined a detailed knowledge of what needs to be done to make a difference with an understanding of the realities of frontline work and hard-pressed services. And I think that sounds very familiar to us, the frontline hard-pressed services and the reality we have to cope with. He has published over 80 items in the areas of employment, disability, empowerment and inclusion, including a number of landmark policy, commissioning and practice publications. Peter, thank you very much for coming, for answering, to respond to our invitation. And we're very grateful that you're going to share with us from your vast experience in inclusion. Please.
Well, good morning. It's really good to be here and a real privilege to come and share some time with you. I think I'm going to learn more than you do this time. There's a great deal of inquiry and further questions and things for me to think about. I haven't got this subject worked out. I'm still on a journey, trying to solve the problems, trying to think about how to make this all make sense. So I'm here to learn. I hope you are too. There's a good deal of things to think about and work on. But I want to say something about the journey that I've had and just a few of the simple things that to me have made sense. And as I've tried to share some of the ideas with other people, some of these things have worked for mixed audiences, people who have used services, frontline staff, sometimes people who've not made much use of education, and also for some people who work in academic environments. So there's a lot for me to try and get through, and here we are, okay? Okay, so there's quite a lot of material I'd like to talk to you about this morning. And really just to start some discussions, hopefully, which we can continue over later on in the day or in other times. So I want to begin with just setting the stage, really, and describing some main headings, talking about some of the areas which to me are important. And I need to say that I have no idea at all whether any of these ideas are useful to you here in Israel. I used to work in my earlier life. I worked in a supermarket, and my job was to put the food on the shelf, and it was the customer's job to decide whether they liked it or not. Yeah? So my job this morning is to put it on the shelf, and if you like it, you take it. If you don't like it, leave it there. Not my problem. So here we are. The first thing I want to say is that some of this work is about co-producing recovery, thinking about how we support ourselves and each other, how people who work in mental health services can support individuals to take more control of their own recovery. Let me come back to that. I don't think this is a finished piece of work in England. We'll see whether it's working as effectively as it needs to in Israel. Secondly, how we help those recovery services to do their job really well. Notice those are different areas. The first one is about the person, and the second is about what the recovery services do. And the third challenge is how we support the community to be welcoming, so that people have a life that's bigger than the services they receive. People need a life beyond the service. And sometimes we get to a stage when we're working in mental health services. I guess there's some people here who work in services. Give me a wave. Quite a few people. Okay. What can happen is that our vision gets shrunk. It gets small, so that all we see is the services that people get. And we imagine that all that people can have in their life is to do with the services. So sometimes we end up saying to people, if we can't provide it, you can't have it. And that's because we've got a shrunken view, a small view of what it's like for people. And so much of this talk is about how we get that bigger vision, that people have a life that's bigger than the services they receive. And that's a life that is mostly lived in the community and not just in the service. So they're my three headings. Are you in the right lecture? Anybody thought they were doing 14th century Peruvian architecture? Next door. Okay. So, moving on. Here's somebody who has made good use of the recovery process. So clearly she has managed her time. She's dressed and ready for the conference. She's clearly paid a great deal of attention to her personal appearance. One of the things that I've done over a number of years is tried to work out how we can help people who don't like to wash. Do you know anybody like that? Is that just a problem in England? No. Okay. So this is very, very complicated challenge. We're surrounded by messages about appearance and hygiene on the TV all the time. And yet there are some people in the world who seem to be deaf to that, those advertisements and that advice, and some people who seem to pay very little attention to their personal hygiene. I was with a group on Wednesday who were working with somebody in a house, and he can clear the building because of his smell. And this is a real problem. So clearly our princess here has paid attention to her self-care. She's got self-esteem, I suggest. She has got considerable wealth. Notice the expensive tiara. She is respected. However, she is still the marionette. There is still control going on from somewhere else. This is just a metaphor. But sometimes we find in England that even in those services that are called recovery services, people are not in charge. And if you go in and ask people who decides things, then the workers say, oh, the person decides, the person in recovery, they decide what's happening. But if you talk to them, they say, it's the staff. Just a problem in England, perhaps. I was in a place once, and I said, that small sitting room, whose room is it? And every member of staff that I asked that question, they said, oh, that's a room that the residents can choose to sit in. It's a quiet room. If they want to be away from the TV and the noise and the discussion, they can go and sit in that room. If they want to, when they want to. And I spoke to the residents, and they said, sometimes the staff take you in there when they want to have an uncomfortable conversation. The residents thought it was part of the staff space. And the staff thought it was part of the residence space. Am I making sense? Yeah? This working? Okay. So this thing about control we'll come back to. It's a really continuing challenge. And I find that many organizations that I work with, it's like, I don't know, it's as though there is something built into institutions. Amos will help us with this, with his skills around organizational psychology. But there is something in organizations and bureaucracies which kills the spirit, so that we begin with the right values, and then moment by moment, day by day, the control begins to return to the office and the staff and the people in charge. And if we just stop concentrating for a while, then the thing becomes institutionalized. You know, what is the difference between a passionate movement committed to changing the world and a frozen bureaucracy? What is the difference? 3 years. Things get stuck, don't they? Over time, people get stuck. So we have to constantly pay attention to the problem of how we put life back in to the organization. So, this is a recovery vehicle, and we have lots of talk in mental health services over the whole world around recovery, don't we? Constant discussion about this. But this is misunderstanding recovery, isn't it? The metaphor is wrong in so many ways. The professional is driving. The power is with the professional's vehicle and not with the person. The person is not in the driving seat any longer. If they were, they'd be looking back to the past, where they have been, not looking forward to the future, where they're going. They're not deciding on the destination. The person is not in charge of their own life. So there are many ways in which this captures and summarizes how we get the process of recovery wrong sometimes, and we fail to create an environment where the person is in charge. So we talk about co-production. And these are some of the challenges about genuinely equalizing the power and moving from fundamentally a discussion where the powerful listen to the powerless to a conversation where people are much more in charge of their own life. This is a continuing dialogue in England. I don't know whether that's the case here. Onward. And I will end up talking about how communities create spaces where everybody can flourish. And these discussions have been around for a very long time. This particular diagram comes from the 1980s from Australia. 3 models. Just see how this works for you. How about my health? My mental health is in their hands, is in the hands of the professional. Is that true? Well, maybe a little bit, but not entirely. Is this better? My health is in my hands? Well, there's some of that. How about our health is in our hands? This is about working collaboratively so that community and the person with significant mental health issues develop together. So, back to this first question again. How do we work with individuals? How do people themselves, how do we ourselves take more control of our own recovery? Notice I say more control. I think we're on a journey, and this is an ongoing process. So, this is about being person-centered, and this is an easy thing to say, but much harder to deliver. So maybe I just want to suggest some ideas about this idea of being person-centered, because I think sometimes we find ourselves working towards different goals, but using the same words. In England, we have this saying that we in England and the Americans are divided by a common language. We use mostly the same words, but sometimes we mean quite different things. And this creates difficulty. So I have people who talk to me about inclusion, and they mean people who need access to mental health services getting them, people being included in the service. And I mean exactly the opposite, people getting out and being included in the world beyond the mental health service. So I want to just very quickly compare 3 definitions of being person-centered and suggest these are what I call coat hanger concepts. A coat hanger is fixed to the rail. At the top, it's at a fixed point. And then the 2 sides move like this, away from each other. And these are concepts where the more you move down, they're degraded and become of less value, the further apart they get. And the more they move back up again, and they get better and they're understood for their richness and their quality and the best they can be, then the closer they get to one another. And there are a number of concepts like that. As we talk about inclusion, we'll talk about recovery, and they get closer when you get the best understanding, the highest understanding of those things. So I just want to say something about this. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but as I talk to people about what it means to be person-centered, I had somebody at one point say, "Oh, I know what you mean by person-centered. It's Carl Rogers, isn't it?" And that was somebody who was rooted in the counseling tradition developed by Carl Rogers in the 1950s. Some of you will be very familiar with his wonderful work and person-centered counseling. But the person that they were talking to was sitting in a different tradition. And they were based with John O'Brien and some views about person-centered planning, which has particularly been developed in the learning disability, the intellectual disability community. And so I began to think, these are different perspectives which have a subtle mix of probably the same sorts of ideas, but in different proportions or in different ways. And so, very briefly, here are 3 definitions of what it means to be person-centered. And I just want to very quickly describe them, because I think they raise questions about what we're trying to achieve here. So, the tradition of person-centered care, particularly work by Tom Kitwood, working with people with dementia. He was describing how health services, social care services help, and let's apply it to services for people with mental health issues, was really interested in how we deliver the psychiatric care for people in a way which is respectful of the individual. So he wanted to make sure that people weren't subject to repeated interviews. Does that happen here? Where you see one person and you have to tell your story, and then somebody else comes from a different discipline, a different organization, and you have to tell your story again? And after 30 times, you're telling the story like it belongs to somebody else, and it's not you any longer. And people don't trust each other's assessment, and they have to start from the beginning again. So Tom Kitwood was challenging those sorts of things and saying we shouldn't work in a way like that. We need to make sure that when somebody needs care, it's delivered in a way which is respectful, which is effective, which is based around the individual. We need to shape the support around the person rather than making the person fit into our convenience of our service. We have a pharmacy in England, and for a time their business, I don't know what the word is, but the short phrase that described their business, their target, their mission, was get in, get it, get out. So this is the great shop, isn't it? The shop is open when you want it, so you can get in. You can find the thing that you're looking for in the shop, and you can quickly pay for it, get it. So you're not spending half an hour waiting at the checkout to be served. And you can get out and on with your life, because you actually, most of us don't want to spend our whole time waiting in line in the pharmacy. Get in, get it, get out. That's not a bad motif, is it, for mental health services? It's not a lifelong sentence. It's get on with your life. Get what you need. So that was the first definition. And if we're creating person-centered, respectful services, for us in England, there is work to do. Maybe here too. I had a service where recently the only way you could get access to a physiotherapist was to get yourself a label of having a learning disability, because that was the only physiotherapist in town. It was irrational. The organisation knew it had a problem with that, but couldn't change. The organisation knew it had a problem with something, but couldn't learn. The organisation had a learning disability. Do you have organisational disability here? We have organisations with dementia. They have a short memory. They forget their history and never learn. We have organisations with ADHD, with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, organisations that are constantly inventing new projects, and very quickly they get bored and tired with them and run on to the next activity, never finish anything. Huh? Some paranoid organisations, absolutely. It's worth us thinking through some of those things, isn't it? It's the organisation that has the problem, not the person, sometimes. So here we are, person-centred care. How do we deliver mental health services in a way which is person-centred? Let's move on. Person-centred counselling. This is a tradition which says the solution is inside the person. If we can create an environment where they can diagnose, where they can work out a solution that works for them, and they can be empowered to act on their hypothesis, then the person has the wisdom. And so often, if only people could find the space to discover that solution for themselves, and if only the professionals would believe that the person's solution just might work, then some progress can be made. Person-centered planning is the third definition. Really comes from a learning disability tradition. It's an international approach where Wolfensberger, a sociologist from the States in the late 60s and early 70s, developed some thinking around how we can support people to have a life in the community. I just put that up as a brief summary to highlight these different viewpoints. This last one, person-centered planning, is not very interested in fixing people. It's more interested in fixing the community. It's quite interested in helping people live well with continuing impairment, because it comes from a tradition of learning disability or physical disability. It's quite interested in seeing how people might find a place to belong as who they are, rather than helping people to somehow solve all their problems before they're ready. This tradition, person-centered planning, says that people are included from birth. You start in the community. You don't earn the right to join it by behaving properly, by conforming to traditional conventions. It says that if everybody is in community together, then the community is richer and excluding people from that community impoverishes not just the person, but impoverishes the community as well. These are some of the challenges from that perspective. I raise those things because they are sometimes under the surface of our beliefs and assumptions about where we're trying to get to with this. Is our vision about an efficient service which is treating people well? Is it about seeing beyond the service the person finding their own journey of recovery? Is it about people seeing a life in the community beyond the service? All of those things, surely. But it would be interesting to ask the person, wouldn't it, what they think the mix is all about. So let's just talk a little bit about how recovery services can do their job well. And here's a slide which highlights some of the small steps. We talked at the beginning about cooperation and co-production. And some of the challenges here are about how we organize things to put people in control of some of the decisions that get made. So these are very simple things, really. I just highlight them. Some of them are things that you will do already and you will have been doing for years, but some of them may offer some challenges. Let's see how we go. Do some people get personal budgets here? Instead of getting the care, they get the money? Okay, so it happens if the parents provide the funding. Okay, so there's a challenge. The international evidence, as I understand it, is that if you offer people, instead of the worker, you offer people the money and they make the arrangements for themselves for the support, people ask for a smaller budget than they would have had if they'd had the service. It's cheaper. People are more careful with the money and they buy a better service, which is better for them. So it's a real challenge. People get more choices, they have control. And that's really significant. If we believe that people have the wisdom, the insight, the understanding, with the support, to have control of their own support, then personal budgets is the way to go. It's a small number. I've got a slide I think I can show you. Here, these are personal budgets, and this is the number of people per 100,000 population, with 130 local government, local authority organisations along the bottom, and you can see the variety. So if you live in Area 1, you've got a much better chance of being offered a budget than if you live in Area 133. Just to show the variety, we've got a real mix. Back to this. So professionals, I'm guessing that you keep a record of the work you do with people? Yes? And the question here, number 2, is, does the person get to write in those records? No? In some places. Some there is, often there isn't. We still have some places where there's not even a space in the record to get the person's opinion. Or we have people writing things like, it was agreed that. Do you have this kind of thing? You know, the social worker or the nurse writes, it was agreed that. And what that means is, I said it, you couldn't speak, and we said it was an agreement. You're happy with that, aren't you? Well, you've not objected, so you must agree with me. I'm playing. Sometimes, I worked with somebody who always agreed with everything. She'd lived in hospital for 35 years. The records had been lost over time. We thought maybe she'd had a lobotomy. The record wasn't clear. whether she had or she hadn't had that brain surgery. And so I would go and talk to her and say, what do you want? When the hospital closes, do you want to live in a house with other people who've been patients in the hospital? And she said, yes. So I went to see her the next day and I said, hello, how are you? And she said, I'm fine. And I said, would you like to live in a home in the future when the hospital closes, in your own place? And she said, oh, yes. Everything I tried, she agreed. It's quite hard sometimes to really find out. But on this one, this asks, is there a space for the person to write? Or even if they don't write, is there a space for you to write in the first person? The person's own verbatim words. What do they say about the plan or about what's happening? This is a small thing, isn't it? But it's a significant challenge. How do we do this? If I can't read the record and if I can't kind of hear the voice of the person when I look at the record, then I'm missing something significant. They're being done to. They're being cared for. I've not even got as far as cooperation, never mind co-production. Number 3, you have meetings where care is planned or recovery is planned. The person sits down. Do they come into the meeting? Yeah? I'll tell you one thing we have, it's quite common, is we have the professionals meeting and they have a small conversation first and then they invite the person in. So when I ask the question, are people in their meeting? They say, oh yes, the professionals. Oh yes, we're in the meeting. No, they're not. They're in the second meeting. In the first meeting, it was just the workers. They had the conversation. And then they come into the meeting, and the person sort of has a voice. What do you think? We ask your opinion. But it's interesting. Sometimes there are a large number of people in the room. Do you have this sometimes? I went to one meeting once, and I was a professional, but I was asked to go and sit in the meeting to have a conversation with the staff. There were 14 people there. 14 people in the room. And within 5 minutes, oh no, let's go first. I went in, they were all sitting around the edge like this, and I had a seat here. And everybody had a cup of tea, and I didn't. And I didn't know most of the people. I'd sort of seen one or two of them, but most people were strangers. And within 5 minutes, when I spoke, my face was going red, and I was stammering. And I talk for a living. This is my job. And I was frightened and anxious, intimidated. I wonder what it's like for the person who came in after me, whose care was being discussed in that group. It's not so long ago. And then you have a situation where there is one big chair with arms. Who's sitting in the chair? The psychiatrist in England. And they're sitting with their back to the window. So there's a halo of light around the doctor's head. And in one meeting I was in, the person was excited and they got up out of their seat and they moved around the room. And they went to grab the notes, the medical notes. And the doctor wouldn't let them hold the notes. And the person said, "You've got my mind in there." And afterwards, when she had left the room, the doctor said, "Clear evidence of psychosis." I think actually, "You've got my mind in there" is quite an accurate description of the psychiatric case record. If you're doing a person-centered meeting, if you're doing a meeting which is about co-production, the person is not just chairing the meeting, but they're deciding who attends. And if you're doing an inclusive meeting, which is really focused on that third column, then there's more community people in the room than professionals. people that the person has invited, people who are important in their life. Could you raise a hand, please, if you invite your dentist to your birthday party? Nobody? We tend to have the important people in our life and not people who are paid to be in our life. This is a challenge for how we run our services. Number 4. Give me a wave if you, in the service that you know best, if you have a meeting sometimes where the people using the service and the staff get together and talk about how the service is running. Does that happen? Do you have a meeting to talk about it? In some places, that happens. Okay, thank you. So again, that would be another part of it. Number 5, people asking people who use the service, what do you think of the service? A kind of TripAdvisor feedback. What do you think of what you've got? Asking people for their views. Easy stuff to do. Number 6, on the management group. This is not just to talk about the service, let's collect your ideas, but it's actually saying, are there a couple of people who belong to the service, who use the service? Are they on the management group that makes the decision about how the service works? Are we hearing the voice of the person with lived experience, the service user? Are we hearing their voice in the management meeting? Number 7, managing budgets. Number 8, showing guests around. Is that a common thing? So it's people in recovery who are showing people around the service. They are the hosts. And of course, they hold the key to get into various rooms. So whose property is it? If the keys are being held by the staff, don't waste my time with talk about the person who's in charge. I want to know who has the keys. Changing the building, DIY jobs, painting, repairing things, looking after the grounds, seeing the finance and performance data. In many services in England, the staff who work on the front line have to fill in forms about how many people did you see and how much work did you do and so on. And they send those numbers away and never see them again. Sometimes they're fed back to the people themselves. This is how you did. This is how we understand what you did. And in a small number of services, the people who are receiving care, who are on the recovery journey, get that information about how the place is running. Teaching staff. There's a wonderful movement coming out of Scandinavia which says if you don't have people using the service on the platform, we won't attend the conference. If you don't have people using the service in the audience, we won't attend the conference. Some real challenge about how we do those things. And then people getting jobs in the service. And finally, co-authoring publications. Just as an example. How are we doing on co-production? Work to do? We have work to do in England on these things. I'm a dreamer. So here's an example. You know, I said that people say they've got it sometimes. Sometimes people working in services think they've got it right. They think they've achieved it. But actually, when you look at it, it's failing. What do you think of this letter? So this was a letter sent to the patient, sent to the person with mental health issues. The Active Recovery team meet regularly to discuss your ongoing care. I'm already feeling nervous, are you? We talk about your care. During the year, you will have contact with various disciplines, care coordinator, doctor, social worker, etc. The Active Recovery team plan to review your care as a whole team. We're going to do this once a year in a large forum called a multidisciplinary review. There will be quite a large number of people present Who's deciding who comes? The staff, the workers. 6 to 8. And you may find it intimidating to attend such a large meeting. And we understand if you or your carer do not wish to attend. However, we will still proceed in your absence, and the outcome will be related back to you and your carer if you wish. We have planned this meeting for such and such a date. Person-centered? I don't think so. But it's a recovery team, so they're sorted. So here we are in a situation where we're doing recovery to people. It's more like that slide of the recovery vehicle and the broken down car. It's being done to the person, and they can join in if they want to. Oh, just a very brief reference. So I'm obsessional. Well, just a little bit. So I've asked the question. I don't know how many people there are in the room, but I would ask, I won't do it today, but just follow the idea. I would ask you to think about, those of you who work in the mental health service, okay? So the first thing would be, I'd say, and we do raise your hands, okay. So, and then the question is, were you interviewed for your job? I guess most of you were. If you have a job, you would be interviewed by a panel of people. 2 or 3 people would interview you. And the question then is, was there a person using the service on the panel that gave you your job? It's a fair question, isn't it? You see, we're supposed to be, mental health professionals are supposed to be relating well to people in recovery. Who will judge that best? A person who uses mental health services. So they should be on the panel as well. If we're co-producing mental health services, and if you'll get offered your job by a panel that includes somebody who uses the service, it changes your relationship. It changes you here and here. How you think about your relationship, your work, because they gave you your job. I've asked that question, as you see, to nearly 2,500 staff. As I say, I need help. I've asked that question, and these services here, no hands went up. Not a single person in the audience was appointed that way. But look here. That's 88%. Most people in the room who had a job in the mental health service were appointed by a panel in that way. I was appointed to a job in that way in 1988. This has been around a long time, but we still struggle to make it a reality. Are we co-producing? If we believe in the wisdom and the experience and the insight of people who've used mental health service, that gives you a distinctive power and effect. It gives you an insight into what's going on. Then this is the sort of thing that we're doing. I used to run a day service, and there was one particular lady in that day service. She'd spent 20 years, more than 20 years, in one of our high security hospitals, which basically means she'd killed somebody or something like that had happened, and she was in a prison hospital, high secure place, where people who'd done very serious things and their behavior was very challenging. She'd spent more than 20 years in that environment. She couldn't read and write. She was the sharpest person I've ever met in assessing staff dynamics. If ever I had to have a serious conversation with one of my staff members in the office, she would know immediately what had happened. She could read staff relationships and staff dynamics like nobody else I've ever met. That was how she survived in the big hospital. She had a distinctive gift in that. One time we were running a, it's not really the best arrangement, but it's one thing that some people go for. We were running a twin panel arrangement So the people in recovery had their own interview panel and interviewed everybody, and the staff had a panel. So everybody was interviewed twice. And the staff panel nearly appointed one particular individual because everything looked right. The interview went well, everything looked right. And the people who used services came in and said, we saw that person, they talked all the right talk, but something's wrong. We're deeply convinced something is wrong. And the professionals thought, we've not read the references. We've not read the letter from the previous employer. And one of them that came in said, this person is currently working for us. They are a complete nightmare. And I would like them to leave and get another job, but you need to be very careful. This person is, and they gave us a list of problems this person had. The professionals had missed it all. It was the people with mental health issues who'd recognized those dynamics. They knew more than we did about what was going on. So it's a real challenge how we do this stuff. So I want to move on and talk a little bit, this is really where I want to spend some time, about how we support the community, how we work in collaboration with the community. And this is really asking the question about what a community looks like when it's genuinely welcoming. And it opens up all sorts of profound questions about what sort of community we're looking for. And, you know, I'm from England. We've just done Brexit. We've just said we don't want to be part of a community, which is Europe. So I'm not in a position to say anything about walls. I'm not in a position to say anything about division, except that I have a dream, along with many people, of a community where everybody is welcome. I want to spend my effort, work in my life, towards finding ways, as far as we can, of creating a community which is diverse, which celebrates people's differences, which is enriched by the variety that is humanity. Where my children, my grandchildren these days, grow up in a community where using a wheelchair is okay and nothing to notice. It's just ordinary. A friend of mine's small child came back from school and they spent a long time trying to explain to mum about a particular child who'd done well that day in their class. And they said one thing after another. You know, the child who's good at maths. You know, the child who is just good fun. The child who likes to talk, particularly when the teacher's talking, so it's a bit difficult. And eventually, 4 or 5 descriptions in, the child said, you know, the one who sits in a wheelchair. It wasn't the first thing that had been said. Isn't that the kind of community we want our children to grow up in? Is it just me? So we're about building a community which is accepting of diversity, where people are celebrated. And this is the challenge. How do we make this possible? I'm not suggesting it's easy. I live right next to a prison in my hometown in Nottingham. And I've just been working over the last 3 years with a research project that looks at the people who spend the longest time in our high security psychiatric prisons. The people who are never going to be let out. And what do we do? In fact, we ran a research project about this group of people. In order to be part of the study, you had to spend more than 10 years in the high secure setting in order to be included in the study. And we had an advisory group of people with lived experience, people who'd been in locked psychiatric settings, who'd been in secure places. And we had a Skype link, and one of the people in our advisory group guiding the researchers was doing it from inside the prison. He was advising us. Every time we met, he was on the screen and helping us to think about our research project. How do we do this? I don't think we know how to do this in a way that keeps everybody safe yet. And maybe we'll never learn, but I think it's worth the effort. How do we create a community which is welcoming? So here's just a couple of old quotes just to say we've known this stuff for a long time. I don't know whether it's true here, but the first quote about intellectual disability, intellectual impairment. Here's Professor Emerson. Only 1 in 3 people in his study with learning disabilities had even one person in their network who was not also a service user, a staff member, or a family member. Does this ring true for some people in mental health services? You know some people who are similarly isolated? Yeah? And here's some work, again, from the turn of the century. More than 1/3 of mental health patients say they have no close contact to turn to for help. Patients are 4 times more likely than the average not to have one close friend. We have a twin process happens in England where people's networks suffer shrinkage and substitution. So that people's relationship network and their role network, they shrink when you first contact mental health services. People disappear from the life of somebody with a mental health difficulty. Just in England? Okay. So it's shrinkage. People's network gets smaller. Not just their relationships, but their roles. People used to be a member of that community. They used to be a neighbor. They used to be a husband or a wife. They used to be an employee. But now those roles have disappeared. Shrinkage, but also substitution. I would say that as members of the public leave by the back door, other people using the service come in the front door. And you end up in a situation where everybody that the person knows is part of the mental health world, apart from maybe 1 or 2 family members who don't give up. That ring true? You know some people like that? These are generalizations. For many people, this may not be true, but that degree of isolation is a key dynamic. Why? Well, very quickly, 3 hypotheses. You can blame the person. Why do people have difficulty in getting jobs? Well, it's hard to get a job when, because of the medication, you dribble saliva all the time. Or your leg does this all the time. It's hard if you struggle to get out of bed in the morning and go to work early. 6:30 is really early. Udi. Thank you. 6:30 was early. We can have a hypothesis which says the reason that people are isolated is to do with a person. And, you know, going back to that issue, if you smell, people don't want to be your friend. If you haven't brushed your teeth for a year, it's hard to get kissed. People don't want to engage. You can say that there's some truth in this. And we have a situation in England where sometimes the family is ashamed and holds the person back. We have a campaign in our learning disability services run by people themselves called Stay Up Late. And it's because adults with learning disability are prevented from going out in the evening by their mum and dad. It's not safe out there after dark. And so adults are treated as children. So there's a real challenge about how this works. There's a second hypothesis. It's very simple, I'm afraid. Sometimes it's to do with the community. Do you have stigma here? No, never, never. We can look at that. Let me ask a different question. What, Commissioner? God! So the question would be, I'm not going to ask you your opinion about which of these 2 explanations is in force. I'm going to ask the Commissioner about the money and where the money is spent and that will tell me which of these you believe. If the money is all spent on fixing the person rather than fixing the community, then you've just demonstrated what you believe by the way the money is spent. There's a third hypothesis, which is the way we organise stuff. We're terrible in England at solving the employment problem with people with mental health issues. I was with a group of people just the other day working on a project which will come to an end in a year. And yet again, an employment initiative for people with significant mental health difficulties. In fact, with mental health issues and criminal background. That project will stop, probably, unless we're very fortunate. As similar projects have run and stopped and run and stopped and run and stopped for 30 years. We haven't been serious about fixing the problem of how you get from using the mental health service to having a job. It's simple, isn't it? The logic. Why don't we have people move from being a tax taker to a taxpayer? But we have real difficulty around fixing that. I continue to try and challenge people about it. Here's one way of thinking about what we're doing. When do I need to stop? We okay for a bit? Sorry, half an hour, okay. So I want to introduce you to a really simple way of thinking about mental health services that I use a lot in England, and it uses the English traffic lights, which I think is slightly different from the traffic lights here. I could have used another metaphor for a 3. This is simply an easy way of helping us to think about 3. And this is a model. It's a theory, it's a hypothesis. And I like this quote from a statistician, George Box. It's a model. And he said, all models are wrong, but some are quite useful. And I just like that. Every theory we have will fail. Every model, every assumption that we use will be wrong eventually. If I tell you that somebody has schizophrenia, do you know everything you need to know about the person? No, you don't. It's a limited framework. It tells you a little, but not enough. So this is a very limited thing, and I say to people, please use this while it works, but at some point it will stop working. Please throw it away and find something better. So this is my health warning on this image. The other thing to say very quickly is this is about inclusion. Now, we use our traffic light system quite a lot to evaluate the value of services. So red means stop. And if you get, in many traditional services, if you get marked as a red, then your service will be closed. It's used in that way. I'm not using this in that way. I'm simply thinking about inclusion. I'm thinking about people having a life beyond the services. So here we go. When I say red, I mean a mental health building where you're surrounded by mental health people. The people you meet by spending time there will be mental health folk. They'll be recovering from mental health issues, they'll be experiencing mental health crisis, and it will be a mental health building. Do you have any of those? You have some red places here? I guess you do. I'm not saying anything about the quality of them. They might be fantastic, but from an inclusion perspective, every extra day you spend in a red place strengthens your bonding relationships within that community and weakens your bridging relationships out into the community. You get that? Thinking from social capital. You strengthen the bonding connections within the red place. You get to know the people better who use that. You create roles and identities and connection inside the mental health world. And you weaken your connections in the wider community. You spend less time in those places. Here's amber, yellow if you like. So yellow is when you're in an ordinary building which is used by other people, but when you go into the group it's a mental health group. Have any groups like this? We have college classes. People can go to college to study. But when they go into the college, they're a student with everybody else. But sometimes they go into the classroom and everybody in that class is a mental health patient. Do you have those? Yeah, sometimes. Or people go bowling and the group is a mental health group. People go to the cinema and it's a mental health group. People go to the sports centre. It's a mental health group. Here's green. You're in a place which belongs to the community and you're side by side with a member of the public who, as far as you know, doesn't have a mental health difficulty. They might, but as far as you know, they don't. And you don't need that badge. You don't need to wave your bottle of pills in order to get in. So I use this as a quick way of thinking about what we're doing. So let's just play with it. How about you run a computer class in the mental health base? Red? Yeah? It's in the mental health building. Mental health building, mental health people. Red? And then you move, maybe it's going to be 12 sessions. You do 6 sessions in the mental health building, and then the whole group moves to the college, and you study alongside other students, but you're still in the mental health group. Yellow? And then somebody moves and joins an ordinary class open to the general public. Green? So you're in the mental health class, yellow, and you go down for downstairs for a cup of tea at the break, and you have your tea with everybody else. Green tea. You're just in with everybody else, yeah. But actually, everybody from the mental health class sits on the mental health table. Yellow tea. So this is just a quick way of playing around with what you're doing. I was in a hostel recently, last week, where people were, it was a mental health building, and they were trying to help people get out. And they said, we're helping people get out into the community. I said, where do they go? And they said, well, they go to the day centre for mental health. Oh, well, where else do people go? Oh, well, some of them go to a group in the community centre. Yeah, but who goes to the group? Oh, mental health patients from other projects. You see, they were just doing yellow. They hadn't got to green. Does this work? It makes sense? Yeah? And it's just asking the question, where are we helping people? I had one worker. They worked in a mental health day centre. And they said their job was, they were called the inclusion worker. It was their title. My job is to help people get out. So they helped people get out of the mental health day centre, and they referred people to the day centre for homeless people. So people left, but they were still part of the welfare system. So this helps us to think about what we're trying to do. I want to go back to just another way of looking at it, which talks about the different ways to meet people. So this starts off just by saying that people make friends in mental health places. You agree with that? Yeah? And that's good. And I don't want to leave the idea that somehow a friendship between somebody in recovery and another person who's also in recovery, I don't want to suggest that's a bad thing. It's a good thing. Any friendship between two human beings, unless it's exploitative or abusive, any friendship is a beautiful thing. So people do make friends in those places. And that's true for all kinds of places, whether it's mental health or anything else. In England, lots of women make friends in the maternity service. And sometimes you can talk to them 20 years later, and they say, I still have a friend, and we met at the class learning how to be a mother. or the person who was in the next bed when my baby was born. We're still friends. And for some people, that's a really important thing. So I want to say that friendships inside services are good. However, my focus and my preoccupation is about the life beyond the mental health system. So what about this one? Now, these are places that folk often think about when, in England at least, when we talk about inclusion. You say, what are you doing? Are you getting out from your hostel? And people say, yes, we're going out. Where do you go? Well, we ride on the bus, and we go to the shops, and we go to the place to pay the bills, and we go for a walk in the park, and we go to the cinema. Oh, good. You're doing a lot of things that help people to use the community. Let's just start from a different place. Let's imagine that you, for some reason, you came to live in my home in Nottingham, in England. You've moved there. Anybody been to Nottingham? Apart from Amos and Udi? You've been? Okay. Well, I'm sorry, sir. You're going to have to move to Carlisle. Have you been to Carlisle? You have been to Carlisle? Bother. Have you been to Glasgow? Yeah, oh. Okay. Have you been to Hucknall? No. Okay. You get to live in Hucknall. Everybody else, you get to move to Nottingham on your own, with no family and nobody else at all. This is your first time living there. You have never, ever lived there before. You know nobody in that place. And you have to, well, my guess is, if you're going to live there for the rest of your life, you would want to make some friends. Am I right? You would, most of you. Some people like to live a quiet life. But most of you, you would want to get to know some people. So I'm going to offer you the way of doing that many mental health services in England use. I'm going to ask you to ride on the bus, to go shopping, to go for a walk in the park, and to go to the cinema. After 6 months, how many friends will you have? 0. Unless you're a very unusual person. And sometimes there are people. Even if you have a little routine going, so maybe you have a job in Nottingham, in Hucknall, sir, and you're going to get on the bus, and every morning you go to the same shop by the bus stop, and you buy your packet of cigarette papers, or the newspaper, and you go there every day, and you say hello to the shopkeeper every day. This is good, isn't it? Will he invite you to his party? It's very unlikely, isn't it? Will you invite him to your party? Much more difficult. So these places, these amenities in the community, this category of places, these are places that you would visit with a friend, but these are not places that you would visit to make a friend. Do you get that distinction? Yeah? If you wanted to start a friendship, you wouldn't go to the cinema and sit on your own and hope to make friends with the person sitting in the next seat. This would not be appropriate behavior. It would be quite risky behavior. But this is what many mental health services in England do. They help people to use the community, to use the amenities. And it helps people survive, but it doesn't make life sweet. Doesn't make life taste good. And so I mention this because it's so important for setting the right goals for what we're trying to accomplish. If people are isolated and need to make connections, or need the opportunity to make connections, then we need to do something else and not just rely on these amenities. And it's not that we're forcing people to have friends. Nobody is forcing anybody into this situation. But if you move to Nottingham, Hucknall, then what you would do is you would do something to put yourself in contact with people and do that checking out assessment thing, wouldn't you? Of, oh, that person looks interesting. I'd like to get to know them a little. That person, oh, no, thank you. And eventually, maybe, you would have done that in a formal way with enough people. You would have made enough friends that you wouldn't need to do the formal stuff any longer. But maybe at the beginning, you would have to regularly go to the same place where friendships begin. Where there's a long-term group of people in the community. You would go to the synagogue, you would go to the club, you would find the Green Party, you'd sign up to a college class. Not because you're interested, but because it's a place to start some connections. That's what we do in England. Would you do a similar thing? Is that what you'd do if you'd move? So this is paying attention to that area. So in the organisation I worked in a number of years ago, we got as far as this, and we tried really hard to make pathways into these long-term groups. And it was really hard to make progress. We struggled. We tried to really build on people's aspirations, what the person themselves really wanted. We worked really hard at this. We tried to use person-centered approaches. What is it that the person loved to do in their earlier life, before they were ill? Where is the enthusiasm? Where is the interest? Let's learn. And we found that it was very hard to make progress. Nothing much happened. So we went back to the literature. We read, we visited projects, we contacted people, and something came out of that learning. Very simple, but the idea seemed to be that the projects that worked best, that were most successful, did so by specializing. Understanding the whole of the community is difficult. So what we did, we ended up chopping up the community into topics and asking people to specialize. And here's my way of doing it. I don't know whether this would work here, whether a different approach would make sense, different categories would work. It doesn't matter to me. But this works for us as a way of chopping up the community to make it manageable. So my little group last week at the hostel, by the end of the training day, each staff member had taken one of these topic areas to focus on. So if I was to ask you, first of all, if you think about your friendship circle, who is it in your life? Not people who are paid to be there, but people you like there because of just they're your friend, you care about them. Your life would be poor if they were not part of your life. Where did those friendships begin? And if I asked you to make that little list in your head and see if you can tick off any for where these friendships begin. Any of these friendships begin at work? For some people, this is really crucial, isn't it? One of the reasons it's so important to support people to find employment, not just because it's money and it's status, but it's also a good friendship place. Lots of people meet their partners at work, and it's a crucial area. So work answers some of it. You're friends with the people you work with now, or when you left a job and moved to something else, you got to that point of saying, it's been really great working with you, I don't want it to stop. Let's move on. Let's turn this working relationship into a friendship instead of just a work colleague. So you change the quality of that relationship. Work. How about neighborhood? Do you know the people who live close by? Of course, there's a life journey going on here. When you're 8 years old, in England, you probably play with children who live close, or go to school with the children who live near you. So knowing people who live close. If you're 88 years old, knowing some people who live close will keep you alive. People will see that you've been, maybe you've not been out recently or not opened your curtains or something's wrong, and they'll come and check you. 10 minutes, okay, nearly done. Volunteering, some people make friends through volunteering, and that's an important area for some people. For some people, joining in with arts activities, music, joining a band, making music together. For some people, it's school or university, doing an evening class. I've used the general term identity. This is all about faith. It's about politics. It's about your vision for the world. Or it's about, at heart, who you are. People in a cultural minority, people with an unusual, infrequent sexual orientation, perhaps lesbian or gay people. For them, it might be crucial to be connecting with other people who share that identity. People who have a variety of connections. For those individuals, then belonging to that community is crucial. That's the community you would track down and join if you moved to Nottingham. It's the army. There you go. Okay, that's an important, again, lifelong friendships through that. Absolutely. Thank you. Sport is another one. And of course, for many people, it's those online connections. So if people are missing out on those opportunities, finding ways of reconnecting with those. And through my own experience, for what it's worth, making those connections and having, in the service, having people specialize in those areas and develop knowledge and expertise in those areas is essential to building relationships. There's a project in one part of London. Every one of these areas developed a partnership group where the mental health service met with, in employment, they met with employers. In the education community, they met with college and university people. The sports people, all the sports groups and organizations, the leisure centers, the sports facilities, all those people met for an exchange of information and communication session. And in there was the mental health service. How do we open up opportunities in this environment for people to participate? How do we create pathways into those things? Every one of those groups was started by mental health, but after 3 or 4 years was being run by the community organization, not by the mental health service. So it was about making those connections, building pathways. Then there's the question about whether groups are welcoming. So as part of training, I've asked staff and people using services to go out and have a look at community groups and organizations. You cannot learn about the community from the computer. You have to go out and meet people, connect with organizations, visit. I say to organizations, at the very least, every single worker should visit a new place at least once a month, maybe once a week or once a fortnight. Go and write a report about it. We need to be equally sophisticated at understanding community organizations as we are at understanding the person. Do you have assessment documentation for people? Yeah? Do you have assessment documentation for the community? Well, you won't make inclusion work then. We need to be as sophisticated in our understanding of the community as we are of the individual, if we're going to make an effective match. So this is simply saying, when people came back after visiting a community organization, a college, a faith building, a community center, a cycling club, any sort of group that is run in the community, by the community, for the community, When they did that visit, when they came back, the first question, before we ask, how much does it cost to join? Do you need any special equipment? Do they understand about mental illness? How can you join? Before we ask any of those questions, we ask the first question, which is, did you feel welcomed? It's a good question. It's a very simple question, isn't it? And what people have said to me is, if people feel welcome, you can work with them. They can know nothing about mental illness. They can be deeply ignorant. They can be full of stigma. But if they welcome, you can work with them. And people can get on a change journey. So just as we expect the person to move forward in their recovery journey, we expect the community to move forward in its recovery journey, to recover from stigma and discrimination. And we walk alongside people in communities to develop that. How many people came back from those visits feeling welcomed? The answer is over 80% report that the community groups and organisations welcomed people. That figure is a shock to most people in English mental health services. Most people in English mental health services would have guessed maybe 30% of people come back with a welcome. I've got the evidence. That's 561 visits, 561 community groups. People came back saying, I felt welcomed. Charlie Rapp developed and articulated the strengths model for mental health back in the 1980s, 90s, early 90s. And he said that in order to work effectively with people with serious mental health issues, we need to work with their strengths. If somebody has been in hospital for 50 weeks in the last year, what do we focus on? The 2 weeks they were out. We pay attention to what's worked. You know this, don't you? This is familiar stuff. And we cannot work well with people unless we pay attention to the positive things. The problem is, in England, that people pay attention to half of what Charlie Rapp said. Because he said, we need to pay attention to the strengths of the individual and the community. And so we have developed, I would say that most recovery services in England do pay attention to the person's strengths. But many of them are still deeply ignorant about the community. And when you ask them about the community, they tell you what's wrong with it. Their stories are stories of stigma. Their stories are stories of discrimination. And we need to replace those stories with stories of welcome and hospitality. And if we don't tell those stories to one another, we're not going to work successfully with the community and help them move forward. I just want to finish by talking about how people are supported one-to-one in community places. Do you sometimes have people go out one-to-one? One person in recovery, one person who's the worker, who's employed to accompany people, sometimes out into the community? Not everybody does this. Not everybody needs it. Some people go out and do things, live quite independently in the community without support. That's fine. But for some people, they go out into the community with a worker. And I've been asking services in England if they talk about how you provide support one-to-one in community settings. And I'm struggling to find examples of English mental health services where they have the conversation. Because I think it's difficult to do that one-on-one support, particularly if the person has challenges in their behaviour. I was supervising a worker one time, and he told me in supervision that he'd been on the bus upstairs on the bus with somebody who uses the service. Now, that person didn't like somebody sitting next to him on the bus. So the person with mental health difficulty was sat on this seat, and 3 seats behind was the mental health worker. Okay? And this person got a bit upset. And I have to tell you that when he got upset, he screamed. And I have never, ever heard anybody scream as loudly as this gentleman did. And so he began to scream. And the worker said to me, after a minute or two, he said, I feel really bad telling you, but I have to confess that I seriously thought none of the other passengers know that I'm his worker. I could just get off the bus and leave him there. He said, the thought passed through my mind. Anybody been there? You think I could just, maybe? How do we effectively support people? I think some services support people like this. Excuse me. This is how we support people. I'm supporting you. You are being helped by me. Now, we don't wear one of these, big pointy hand. But sometimes we behave like this. We do it in all sorts of ways. In England, people wear a big bunch of work keys on their belt. Social workers carry a blue diary under their arm. They all drive a Fiesta car. I was in a waiting room at a train station, at a railway station, and a group came in with a worker. And the worker went and stood on the back of a chair and said, everybody pay attention. She didn't mean everybody. She meant her group. And I was just a member of the public. But there is no way that that group could now fit into the community. They'd done this. They'd done big hand support. Will you remember this? We do this really easily. We mark out people. We don't give people a chance to join in. We have sometimes, we call them tea dances in community places. And retired people, maybe in their 60s, will go along and do some very slow dancing in the group. And so a 60-year-old gentleman will go along with a young female 22-year-old worker. What's the chances that they will blend in and look as though this is a person and their friend? It's not easy to do this. So sometimes we start with the community. We start with the idea that people need to belong, and then we label them up. We mark them out. And you know, there's a really important and terrifying aspect of this. I came across a team once, and they were given name badges. And the culture in that team is that they would put their name badge on when they went out with somebody. They put it on when they went out. So the message is to the general public, please don't think I'm choosing to be with this person. Please understand that I'm only in their presence and in their company because I'm paid to be here. Please understand this person doesn't deserve a friend. We have to be really careful about how we do this. There are some really complicated things, subtle things, about how we go about building collaboration with the community. And I guess I wanted to leave you with that story because it highlights some of the many ways in which the institution encroaches and colonizes and takes control again of those informal relationships. Maybe I've not said enough about how we can work collaboratively with community to build a community that we would all want to be part of, and where we can all find a place and a contribution. But maybe we've started that discussion. Maybe that's something we can continue as we go through the day. It's a journey many of you have been on for many years already, but I hope it's helpful just to explore a few perspectives from England at least. Thank you very much indeed.